Welcome back. For those of you just joining us, we'll have a summary of the latest news from the Gulf War in a moment. We'll bring you right up to date. But first, a short while ago, the Iraqi ambassador here in London gave his reaction to the outbreak of war. He said there had been heavy civilian casualties, but that Iraq would fight on.
The enemies attacked the civilian targets, although they claimed that they did not attack civilian targets. I have no details about the casualties. They should be very heavy.
Will the ferocity of the attack force Iraq to compromise?
Not at all. We believe in our cause and we will defend our cause.
The Iraqi ambassador in London. Well, it is now 1 o'clock. If you have just joined us, the latest news from the Gulf is that there are unconfirmed reports of some ground fighting on the border between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. But our reporter in Saudi Arabia says he can confirm that British forces are not involved. The Defence Secretary Tom King has confirmed that an RAF Tornado and her two-man crew are missing after the second wave of airstrikes against Iraq. And the Americans have just confirmed that one of their aircraft was brought down during the raids. Well, in the United States, reports that the war had begun came as the television networks were broadcasting their main evening news bulletins. Later, President Bush went on television to address the nation. Our Washington correspondent, Bill Neely, reports on how the United States took the news.
America is awakening to news of successful airstrikes and a war with no confirmed Allied casualties.
From ABC, this is
a war that came to America's homes 6 minutes into the evening news broadcast.
We're going to dump out of that piece by Gary Shepard at the moment and go back to him live on the telephone, for he has an up-to-date report. Gary.
Peter, I am looking directly west from our hotel now, and throughout the entire sky there are flashes of light. It appears to be some sort of anti-aircraft fire.
President Bush had been watching. He told his spokesman to confirm the attack.
The liberation of Kuwait has begun. In conjunction with the forces of our coalition partners, the United States has moved under the code name Operation Desert Storm.
America stopped in its tracks.
The White House has announced the liberation of Kuwait at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
2 hours and 25 minutes after the first report, the president addressed the nation.
As I report to you, air attacks are underway against military targets in Iraq. We are determined to knock out Saddam Hussein's nuclear bomb potential. We will also destroy his chemical weapons facilities. Much of Saddam's artillery and tanks will be destroyed.
He hoped it would be a short war with casualties held to a minimum. Minutes later, his defense secretary announced that war had been decided hours before the UN deadline expired.
the targets being struck tonight are located throughout Iraq and Kuwait. Our focus is on the destruction of Saddam Hussein's offensive military capabilities.
We have not been targeting Mr. Saddam Hussein. The purpose of our bombing facilities in the area of Baghdad is essentially to go after the command and control system of the Iraqi armed forces.
The attacks continue as I speak.
The news has stunned America. At homes, in halls and churches, they watched and listened in disbelief to the noise of war.
Right, it's broken out on either side of us here at the hotel, and I'm just going to be quiet and let you listen.
There were protests, these outside the White House, but congressional opponents of the war are now rallying behind the troops.
I think all of us are deeply concerned that this war now be as short as possible, that, as the President indicated, it be with the minimum loss of life and is decisive in its result.
President Bush rose before dawn. His only comment on the war so far, things are going well. Bill Neely, ITN, Washington.
Good morning. And Bill Neely joins me now live from Washington. Bill, first of all, any latest news on the reports of an American aircraft that has been downed?
Yes, within the last few minutes, the Defense Secretary Dick Cheney has confirmed the first American loss. He says one U.S. aircraft was shot down over Iraq. He said that in a telephone call to Sam Nunn, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and he later confirmed it to journalists. It's thought it was an F-15E. The crew of 2 are missing. The Pentagon has also said, in response to questions about casualties, the Pentagon said a handful, relatively small. They also said that the Iraqi claim that 14 Allied planes were shot down was patently ridiculous. But they've made no comment on the claims that ground forces are now engaged. Overnight, when that was put to one military spokesman, he said, "I've no knowledge of what you're describing," but that was several hours ago.
Bill, during the night it was reported that all the aircraft from that first aerial attack returned home safely. Can we assume that this missing aircraft, like the RAF Tornado, was part of the second wave of attacks that happened in daylight?
Difficult to assume until the Pentagon gives us firm confirmation in 1 hour's time. But as you said, that was their line on the first wave of bombings.
Bill, what is President Bush's schedule today?
Well, just as we speak, he's due to begin an intelligence briefing at which he'll be shown satellite reconnaissance photographs of the devastation in Baghdad. He will then meet with Secretary of State Baker. He had breakfast with him earlier, and in an hour and a half's time he will meet with congressional leaders, and there we are expecting to hear more news of how last night's attacks went.
Bill Neely in Washington, thank you very much indeed. Well, we've just received a report from our correspondent Jeremy Thompson, who was the only British television journalist to see the aftermath of the shelling at an oil refinery near the Saudi border.
At the cutting edge of the Allied land force, an American infantry unit dug in almost within sight of the Kuwait border. Their task to probe ahead of the front line as the Liberation Army moved forward. Straddling the main road to occupied Kuwait, they'd set up a checkpoint as a sudden stream of vehicles came towards them, fleeing to the south. On the horizon, the reason why. A huge black trail of smoke betraying where incoming Iraqi artillery had struck an oil refinery inside Saudi Arabia. It seemed that everyone from the town of Khafji had decided it was time to leave, including the police and the fire service. Above all, the soldiers were waiting for the possibility of spies. A team from Kilo 33 platoon set off to check the state of the communities the Saudis had left behind. On the outskirts of Khafji, a clear sight of the fire raging in the damaged oil plant. We were now just 6 miles from the Kuwait border. The sergeant and his team stopped to survey the ground ahead. They'd had reports of figures seen on rooftops, possibly enemy artillery spotters helping to guide in the Iraqi shells. Overhead, American helicopters kept a brotherly watch on their comrades below. "We're entering the Badlands now," the soldier told his men as they drove through the archway into a deserted town. Khafji had been known as a safe hideout for Iraqi terrorists, but now it appeared no more than a ghost town. 2 hours of Iraqi shelling early this morning had left few obvious marks of damage, but every shop was shut, not a soul was on the street. In the eerie silence, evidence of a panic-stricken evacuation, we came across this car abandoned in the middle of a crossroads. Team Kilo 33 found no sign of hostile forces, though, and no reports of injuries in Khafji. For the moment, the Iraqi artillery has stopped raining down on the deserted town of Khafji. They have had several hits, though the only serious damage is to the oil refinery. What the Iraqis really seem to have achieved is just to drive away the local people. As the oil blaze blackened the border skies, the Allied forces still had not chosen to return fire. Jeremy Thompson, ITN, close to the Kuwaiti border.
Well, now Sandy Gall joins me from Saudi Arabia. He has just been to a briefing in the capital, Riyadh. Sandy, what is the latest from you?
Well, the Americans, John, have just announced that up until 10 o'clock our time this morning, the American and Allied air forces, including, of course, the British and the French, have flown 750 sorties. That was up until 10 o'clock this morning. Obviously, more since then. The American briefer said that the Iraqi response had been limited and in fact there had been minimal resistance on the part of the Iraqis. He said that the whole gamut of American air power and Allied air power had been in use: F-15 Eagles, F-16s, A-10s, F-111s, F-117 stealth and B-52 bombers, plus British-made Harrier. So it really seems as if there was an enormous bombardment, as we've guessed already. That the sheer weight of the bombardment was enormous. And the American briefer added that first assessments of the sorties, of the bombardment, were very encouraging.
Sandy in Riyadh, thank you very much indeed.